Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. The next topic is also a big topic, evolution. So our next speaker, Daniel Brooks, is a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto and fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and at the Linnean Society of London. He's been awarded honorary doctorates, amongst them from one of the finest universities in the world, Stockholm University. He's an evolutionary biologist, and his current focus is understanding and integrating evolutionary principles to understand emerging diseases and how to develop proactive measures. He's an author of more than 350 scientific publications, and his next book that is due in this autumn, called A Darwinian Survival Guide, Hope for the 21st Century, together with Salvatore and Bob. If I got that right. Yeah. So, welcome us in. Looking forward to that talk.
Well, this is one of the worst slots for a speaker, right after lunch. So all of you will be experiencing a postprandial insulin overshoot, which means that some of you will fall asleep. I will not take it personally. But in addition to that, I'm following an incredible presentation. And I'll try to at least not embarrass myself. I'm going to make an attempt to link up some ideas, some things that we've heard this morning, and things that we'll hear later in the conference in the coming days. This is the title of our new book, and Hope for the 21st Century. I don't want you to feel too optimistic about. This is what in Canada we would call a faint hope. The faint hope clause in the legal system in Canada is for serial killers who might possibly have really found Jesus in prison and could be allowed back out into the population, general population. Okay, many of you have seen this cartoon. And what I want to say is, what I want to say about this is that most people take this as an iconic representation of climate change denialism, right? What I'm going to suggest to you is that people who talk about sustainability and climate change in 2023 also subscribe to a form of this. It's a delusion, and it's part of the illusion of control. So what we're doing in our new book, what we've decided is to hope for the best and plan for the worst. In other words, so let's assume that humanity is not going to do the right thing to save itself. The policies that we know we could do to make things better we're not going to enact them. And so around 2050, we're going to be faced with major problems. At best, a major bottleneck for human society. At worst, some kind of collapse, perhaps even a general collapse. And what could we do starting now to try to minimize and mitigate the impact of our own actions? And so that means that what we want to do is we want to change the discourse from sustainability to survivability. Instead of what do we need to do now to maintain the kind of lifestyle we have now, which is fundamentally the purpose of sustainability studies, and change that to how are we going and our descendants going to survive what is coming at us. So many of you will recognize this as a representation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in a sense, what we're saying is that we need to be at the very bottom of that base. That we can talk about the things at the top 3.5 of those levels, but they're not relevant to the existential threat that we have created for ourselves that is barreling down at us at an accelerating pace. And we need to think more about, as just another way of saying, we need to think more about basic survival. Now, it turns out that there is a scientific theory of survival. There's only one scientific theory of survival, and it's called Darwinian evolution. And the good thing about that theory is that it has never failed in 4 billion years. It is the only mechanism that has ever allowed the biosphere to recover from major environmental perturbations. And as I said, it's never failed in 4 billion years. So it's worthwhile, if we're going to think about the possibility of survival, it's worthwhile to perhaps think about the implications of Darwinian evolution going forward for human survival and the survival of technological society. Now, evolution is fundamentally a mechanism for coping with change by changing, as opposed to coping with change by refusing to change, also known as resilience planning, or creating zoos that we call conservation areas. In other words, expending enormous amounts of effort to save biodiversity by doing everything we can to stop evolution. We'll see some other allusions to science fiction along the way, because in fact, many of the issues that have already been raised, for example, with AI and the potential risks of that, science fiction writers have been dealing with these topics for years. And most of my friends who are science fiction writers are looking at things like these chatbots and AIs, and they're just going, yes, and why do you think this is new? But this particular quote by Frank Herbert, that everything is a temporary stopping place on evolution's journey elsewhere. One of the things to understand about evolution is that part of its success is due to the fact that it doesn't create pathways. Evolution has no idea where it's going. It's extraordinarily opportunistic, but it's got no agenda. It's got no place it has to be. The point is, whatever works for survival is fine. Now, that gives us a little bit of optimism in general terms, but you have to understand that underscoring that is that evolution as a property of all living systems within the biosphere does not privilege any of them. There's no species on this planet that has any kind of innate right to survive. And in fact, many species will go extinct during the course of evolutionary time. But life will continue. Species will evolve. There will be something. The issue for us of humanity with respect to evolution is there anything we can do actively to increase the odds that we will be part of the biosphere that continues into the future? Or are we going to be part of the problem? Are we going to be part of the solution, or are we going to be part of the precipitate? Now, the technical aspects, I'm going to talk a little bit about the biology. The technical aspects of this, if you want to wade into the weeds, it's in this book. As most of you know, Springer charges an exorbitant amount of money for its books. You should know, if you haven't written a book for Springer authors do not get royalties on book sales. So I don't mind telling you that there are pirated versions of this out on the internet. I would like you to read this book. I don't care whether you pay Springer for it or not, because I'm not getting royalties. All right. Darwinian evolution is fundamentally a theory of conflict resolution. And we tend to focus on the conflict aspect of evolutionary biology, but Darwinian evolution in particular is a theory of conflict resolution. And it's conflict resolution by means of phenomena that we call ecological fitting in sloppy fitness space, followed by accommodation, all reinforced by natural selection. It's a big mouthful. That's much more elaborate than evolution by natural selection. which is what is popularly said. There's that stuff in the middle. And what it means is that for any species on this planet, when environmental conditions are stable, the species tend to specialize. They tend to exploit their local surroundings. They tend to specialize where they are because the conditions are good. And that's when they accumulate new variation because conditions are good. In a metaphorical sense, they can afford to mess around with evolutionary experiments. There's no great penalty for producing a new variant because conditions are good. So when species are in stable environments, they tend to specialize and they accumulate evolutionary potential. That is, they accumulate variation. When conditions change, when there's a perturbation in the environment, what species do is they begin to explore their surroundings. In other words, if the local conditions are no longer suitable, okay, the species don't magically stay in place and come up with some new idea that allows them to remain where they are and cope with the new conditions. What species do when the conditions change is they move away. They move. So this is, if you think of changing conditions as a kind of conflict between species and their environments, what species do when they come into conflict with their environments is they run away from the conflict. The species that survive are the ones that move away. And there's a wonderful paleontologist named Alicia Stegall at the University of Tennessee who first began to show this pattern in the fossil record back 500 million years ago, that the species that survive these major mass extinctions are the species that are able to escape when the local conditions become unlivable. So, what allows species to move away from conflict when the conditions change is all of this evolutionary potential, all that variation that was accumulated during the good times. So during the good times, you save up evolutionary potential. During the bad times, you spend that potential to get away from the conflict, to escape the danger. And this is a little cartoon version of that. So the large area outlined by that dark line, we're going to call that a representation of all the places on the planet that a given species could live. Now that's called its fitness space. Those are all the places, it's a cartoon representation of all the places on the planet that a given species could survive. It doesn't mean it's the greatest, it's just where they could survive. And up in the upper left-hand corner is a representation of a population of the species that is found in one part of that fitness space. That part of the fitness space that's where the best stuff is. That's where the optimal conditions are, or the most preferable conditions for the species. And as long as those resources are abundant in a particular area, the species is going to stay there and maximally exploit those conditions. Unfortunately, the better the species is at exploiting those conditions, the more likely it is that they're going to have an enormous reproductive success. They're going to become, in a sense, they're going to become a victim of their own success. They will produce a population that is too large for the local resources. Or if that doesn't happen, it's possible that the local conditions will change to a point that that place is no longer livable. When that happens, in either case, the response to that kind of conflict between the local conditions, local living conditions, and the species is for at least some of the members of the species to move away, to leave the place where the conditions are no longer suitable. Now, what happens in this is you now find that the species is more widely distributed in that fitness space. So before, when it was only in a small part of its potential fitness space, it was very specialized. Now it's more generalized in its fitness space. And the interesting thing about this is that when it's very specialized, the proportion of the fitness space that's occupied to the fitness space that is open and potentially available is very large. that means that when a species is maximally specialized, its fitness space is maximally sloppy. That means then that when conditions change, there's the maximum potential new fitness space for the species to move into to escape conflict. And that's what this represents. Now, when the species moves from one part of its fitness space into a new part of fitness space, that part of the fitness space is not necessarily exactly identical to where it came from. It's similar enough to allow the species to survive based on the evolutionary potential, the variation that it had with it. But it's not necessarily exactly the same. So that means that when stable environmental conditions reassert themselves, you now have the potential for two different sets of environmental conditions in different parts of the old fitness space. And in that case, the organisms that have moved down into that new part of the fitness space may very well begin to exploit that part of fitness space in a manner that allows them to differentiate themselves from the population in the original part of fitness space. And when that happens, you then have the emergence of two species from one. Both of those species have overlapping fitness space. There are overlapping parts of the world where they could both live, but they're not competing with each other. And in fact, in this particular instance, if you look at the one in the upper part, let's suppose that the environment where that is deteriorates in some way, and that population moves down into the lower part of its fitness space. The species that's sitting there now has other fitness space it can move into to escape. And this is sort of the diversification pump. This is what Darwin called diversity generating diversity. Diversity begets diversity. And it's through this process of running away from conflict and then resolving that conflict and finding space to survive. Okay. Now, so the important thing for us to remember is that contrary to what a lot of people believe, conflict in evolution does not generate innovation. It does not generate new variation. Conflict uses variation to escape. When there's conflict, organisms use genetic information that they have to escape the conflict. The new variation, the next set of new variations doesn't show up until the conflict has been resolved and the species are living in different parts of fitness space where there is no conflict at the moment between themselves, within themselves, or between themselves and the environment. Innovations happen when conditions are stable, not when they're perturbed. And this is a really critical thing because we have these ideas that necessity is the mother of invention. It's not. Necessity in evolution, necessity is the mother of running away from conflict until you can find a place to live where there is no conflict. Then you can think about innovations. Many of you have seen this diagram, and this is supposed to be it is a diagram of the major extinctions, the 5 previous major extinctions. Okay, and we even, this is from a textbook, we even have these dark arrows right at the extinction points to really emphasize to the student that this is all about the terrible impacts of the mass extinction. And then the text goes on to talk about how human beings are now in the midst of creating the next mass extinction. The problem is that that's not the point of what we find in the fossil record. The point of what we find in the fossil record is what happens to the right of all of those inflection points. That's evolution. Every mass extinction in the history of life on this planet has been an evolutionary reset. What was one of the primary products, evolutionary products, of the extinction of the dinosaurs? Raise your hands. We wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the previous mass extinction. That doesn't mean that we're guaranteed to survive the next one. Yeah, at one point, I'm sure the dinosaurs thought they were going to be around forever. But then, so the trilobites thought they were going to be around forever. The bacteria, oh, they are still around. Okay, now, human beings of some sort or another have been around for about 3 million years. Okay, so that's about 150,000 generations. And for 149,000 of those generations, human beings were just another evolutionary system. Every time the environmental conditions changed and the local conditions were no longer suitable, they moved away. There was a lot of open space that humans could live in. Population densities were low, and there was a lot of space. And so human beings moved around. They would move into places, they would stay for a while. Conditions changed, they would move away. And for 149,000 human generations, that's what human beings were. They were just another evolutionary system. If the conditions change, try to cope with the changing conditions using the inherited capacities that you have. If you cannot cope with the changing conditions, try to run away. If you can't run away, you're extinct. Very simple. Enormously complicated set of outcomes that produces the biosphere. But that's pretty much evolution in a nutshell. Okay, so now we have to talk about that last 1,000 generations of human existence, okay? Because that's where we got ourselves into trouble. And I'm not going to blame anybody or any particular decision that was made by human beings in those last 1,000 generations, because, as we say, it's nobody's fault, but everybody's to blame. And the reason for that is because nobody anticipated. Decisions that were made all seemed like a good idea at the time, and they seemed to work for a while. And then when they didn't work, people tried to fix them. And for most of human existence, if the local decisions didn't work out, you just abandoned where you were living and you went someplace else. And again, that worked for a while, but now we're not in a position that we can do that. So it's not a matter of deciding who was at fault. And in fact, from some of from the talks that we heard this morning, it may very well be that there was never even a possibility that human beings could have understood what they were doing and the consequences of what they were doing. But we certainly know that they didn't have the kinds of knowledge that we have today that would help us see, oh, that's what happened. All right, so now I'm going to talk about our conception of the Anthropocene. When Sal and I were writing the book, we discovered that there's this wonderful very academic literature about the Anthropocene. So there are at least 4 different definitions of what the Anthropocene is. And there are these enormous numbers of articles, each one saying, this is why my definition of the Anthropocene is right and why everybody else is wrong. I mean, this is typical academic kind of churning the database, right? And so we decided that we would make everybody mad by saying, you're all partly right. And so what we've done is we've just said, okay, let's just assume that everybody is seeing something that's real. And we'll just call it all the Anthropocene, and then we'll just have sort of mileposts along the way that correspond to different people's version of what the real Anthropocene is. Okay, so the first is what we call the Great Transition. And that's basically the first 5,000 years after the end of the last glacial maximum. Okay, what did human beings do? This was a period of time when a lot of human beings had been displaced from Europe down into the Levant and farther south, where they had fairly stable conditions and spent a fair amount of time living out the ice age without being overrun by the huge glaciers. At the end of the last glacial maximum, current estimates are that there may have been as few as 3,500 human beings in all of Europe. So the idea that Homo sapiens adapted well to the last ice age, the ones that survived the last ice age were the ones that ran away from Europe, got away from the ice, and hung out where conditions were really good. Well, one of the things that happened during that period of time was that the human beings who had already had domesticated dogs, at least before the last glacial maximum, and who had left evidence of at least some knowledge of plant husbandry, not necessarily agriculture, but some knowledge of plant husbandry. And there's even a site in Africa from 100,000 years ago that suggests that there were groups of humans that understood that certain edible plants would all be ripening at a particular time in a particular place, and different groups of human beings would come together and harvest cooperatively and then split up and go their own separate ways. So the baseline for what became agriculture was already, in the human psyche, in some human populations prior to the last glacial maximum. After the last glacial maximum, we see the emergence of what we would recognize as real agriculture, which is basically not just opportunistically finding the crops that we like, but planting them in a particular place, right? First evidence of an attempt to control. Don't go to where the plants are, bring the plants to where you are, and then try to control the local environment to make sure that those plants can grow where you want them to grow. This is also the point in time where we see the first evidence of sedentary living. Okay, these are not cities and towns yet, but these are permanent settlements. They're basically permanent farming settlements. And they were abandoned fairly easily when climate conditions changed. Okay, in some cases, they were abandoned permanently. In other cases, they would be abandoned during the dry season, let's say, and then people would move back to them during the wet season, this sort of thing. So they might be there only to grow the crop and then go away, but there was some evidence of sedentary living. And human population density, locally and globally, was pretty low. So the potential there was still a lot of opportunity for human populations to avoid each other and avoid conflict by simply not dealing with people they didn't like. Sometime between 15 and 10,000 years ago, we have what we call the Great Amplification. This is when high production agriculture first shows up. Okay, so instead of just saying, let's grow enough plants to take care of the extended family, this is, how many of these things can we grow? How many pigs can we have? How many horses can we have? How many cows can we have? How much wheat can we grow? How much rice can we grow? This is associated with human beings living in particular places all the time. So the sedentary living becomes permanent settlements at this point. This is also a point at which we see the emergence of regular trade routes throughout Europe and Asia. And there's some evidence of some trade routes existing between Eastern Europe and as far as Siberia 100,000 years ago. But this is the point at which we have regular trade routes whose nodes are these settlements. So that's 15,000, 10,000 years ago. All right, so what is happening at this point? A number of things are happening. We have these permanent settlements. We have people who are spending the entire year in one place. They are using overproduction of food as trade goods with other people. So they have anchored themselves in place. They are making a bet that the environmental conditions will never change. Not a good bet. They're also becoming victims of their own success because the word gets out that people are overproducing food, they're trading, they're getting, we're trading food for better arrowheads. We've got technology, people are making pottery. This is a really good place to live. all of a sudden, more and more people are migrating to these places. Now, this includes people who have technical skills that were not in the settlements before. So they're bringing value into the settlement. But at the same time, they're bringing cultural diversity and linguistic diversity into the settlement. So you now have these settlements where, with a growing population that seems to be paying for itself economically, but you have an increasing population that's made up of more and more people who are not closely related to each other. You have medium population density. Okay, these cities are starting to grow. But there's still evidence that those settlements, when hit with major climate change events, major weather event changes, a drought, a flood, something like that, there's still evidence that they were abandoned. The people, even a large population of people, would just abandon the place if something went wrong. And all of that changed sometime around 9,000 years ago. So about 9,000 years ago, and this is what we refer to as the great tragedy of the Anthropocene. There's a research group in Vienna that has called this the rise of the war machines. So that's why we don't talk about the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. We talk about the Bronze Weapons Age and the Iron Weapons Age. Because this is the point in time when those settlements became so large and so economically powerful that people began to say, we're not leaving. Even if the conditions change, we're not leaving. And if the conditions make this place unlivable, but we're staying here, then we will go and take what we need from somebody else. And that was reinforced by any kind of religious institution that said, this is your place. See those pyramids? Your ancestors are here. Your gods are here. You can't leave this place. You're not allowed to leave this place. So we also see at this point in time the emergence of social institutions that, and this is one of the connections with the Buying Time conference from before. The social institutions, it seemed to have initially been created in order to facilitate cooperation among people who were not each other's closest relatives. So you have this town, you have a complex economy, you have people doing all sorts of things, but the town doesn't function properly. The economy doesn't function properly unless people cooperate with each other. But they speak different languages, they look different, they have different religions. You don't know exactly who you can trust because they're not your family. So social institutions are a way to facilitate that kind of cooperation. The problem is that the social institutions also become ways for individuals to amplify personal power, including efforts to mobilize young people to go kill other young people in another town to steal what you need to keep your city going without having to move. So it's about 9,000 years ago, and presumably we're going to find some earlier evidence of this, but this is about the time frame when organized warfare shows up. And it shows up in association with these big cities, with the emergence of social control institutions, which were a really good idea and had an unanticipated consequence of being platforms for people to magnify, amplify their own personal power. The problem is that once you decide, this idea spread really rapidly. Once warfare shows up, within 1,000 years, everybody's at war with everybody else. And fortified cities are showing up in response to the warfare. But the problem is that once you decide that warfare is the appropriate way to deal with your own problems, you commit yourself to a never-ending series of conflicts. There's no conflict resolution in this mindset. It's just one conflict after another. The Egyptians have bronze weapons, the Hittites have stone weapons, the Egyptians need what the Hittites have, the Egyptians go up and they take over the Hittite empire, and they're in control of that area for a while until somebody from the Black Sea begins to smuggle iron and steel weapons into the Hittites that are better than the bronze weapons the Egyptians had. And then the Hittites arm themselves and they move south and they take over Egypt. And then the Egyptians get the iron weapons and they come back, and it's just back and forth and back and forth. And while they're beating each other up, there's this little group of people over in Rome saying, well, we've got the iron weapons. Let's make this military thing really professional. And I'll bet if we have a really professional military, we can take over the whole Mediterranean. And this is just da 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 da. And that's the origin of this particular statement of social life. He who desires peace, let him prepare for war. And that's what we've been doing for 9,000 years to ourselves. And the important thing about this is, this was not an evolutionary imperative. This was a conscious human decision. This was a conscious human decision to change our behavior. And it's not evolutionary. That's the reason it's not working. Evolution works. We then have the Great Deflection. Now, the Great Deflection is usually, there's a correlation between, it's an arbitrary correlation between the date of the first functional steam engine in 1753 and these human population estimates, the human population estimate profile, the human population going whoops like this. So this is a big deflection upward about 1750, about the same time as the Industrial Revolution really got going. And we tend to want to make a connection between human population and the Industrial Revolution and all the problems that happened after that. But the socioeconomic circumstances that led to the Industrial Revolution and that population deflection, that big population boost, actually started in Europe during the Little Ice Age about 300 years earlier than that. So by the time this happens, it was already, in a sense, it was already too late to stop it. It was inevitable that this was going to be good, was going to happen. But given that we had already decided that we had already committed to a socioeconomic plan or a socioeconomic set of behaviors that involved the Industrial Revolution, we then set about justifying what was happening in terms of what we had decided. So this is when we begin to see the emergence of ideas that growth is a good thing. That just growth of any kind at all is a good thing, and it's a way to solve our problems. The more growth, the better. Urbanized settlements now start to become bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay? London at this particular point in time was already a large city when the British made the mistake of deciding to locate the first heavy industries in a city that was already really big. And when they did that, they created a whole bunch of new jobs in London, which drained young people from the agricultural lands around, boosted the population enormously, cratered out the agricultural production, and produced a situation in which the local food supply in London could not take care of the people who were there. Now, the Reverend Malthus recognized that there was a problem. Lots of people, lots of starving people in London. But because he was an Anglican minister, he immediately assumed that that was because the Irish were having too much sex. And it was all about too many people. But it wasn't about sex. It wasn't about population. It was, oops, I didn't do it. Sorry. It was about population density. It's like that cartoon I showed you where everything's all up in that one area where all the really good conditions are. But if you end up having too many organisms for their local resources, they will move away. But what happens if you're trapped and you can't move away? Okay, well, then you compensate by going out and stealing food from other places all around the world. And by 1753, Europeans had been doing that for 300 or 400 years in a very organized way. It was never sustainable. But we kept doing things to reinforce the behavior that we had already decided upon. And it seemed to work for a while. Okay. And then in 1950, one of the most recent proposals for the Anthropocene is what's called the Great Acceleration, around 1950. And the interesting thing about this is that this is associated with an enormous amplification of technological innovation. Now notice that this is 5 years after the end of the Second World War. This is not happening in the middle of the conflict. That's not when the innovation happens. During the middle of a conflict, your focus is on mass production of what you've got. But in the 1950s, conditions were stable enough, environmentally, politically, and so on, that there was this enormous amount of opportunity to play around with innovation. And there's this huge burst of innovation around 1950. And so there's one group of people that think that that marks the real beginning of the Anthropocene. We think that this actually marked the beginning of the end of the Anthropocene. Okay, and it's not surprising that this is also the period of time during the classic period of what's called the golden age of science fiction. This is when a large number of science fiction books, novels, and short stories were written all along the theme of, has human technology outrun human wisdom? And this has been for what, almost 75 years. This has been a theme in science fiction writing. Are we so clever that we're not going to be in control? Now, the preoccupation at that point was with the fear of atomic war. Okay, but within the last 15, 20 years, science fiction writers have been writing similar sorts of things about AI. So if you want to read some primary literature about the potential worries, potential concerns with AI, you've got to be reading a lot of science fiction because it's all there. Okay. But at this point, we've decided that not only is growth good, and the more growth, the better, we've also decided that technology is going to solve all of our problems. So it doesn't matter how badly we treat ourselves, technology will save us from our own self-inflicted wounds. Now, let's talk about, so that's where we are. Okay. Some of you probably read the literature, read in the literature about the fragile biodiversity, the fragile biosphere, and the butterfly effect. Well, it turns out, of course, that the biosphere is not subject to the butterfly effect, because the biosphere is a complex evolutionary system, and it's really robust. It's robust because it's capable of moving around in sloppy fitness space in response to environmental perturbations. If it weren't really, if the biosphere was susceptible to the butterfly effect, the first mass extinction would have taken away all the life on the planet. And if it didn't wipe out all the life on the planet, it would have left just a little bit behind. But that's not the way evolution works. I mean, it keeps coming back and keeps coming back and keeps coming back. There's an enormous capacity to absorb insult and respond to it by diversifying. No, what's susceptible to the butterfly effect is any aspect of the biosphere where biological complexity has been oversimplified and where the basic rules of evolution have been abrogated because of the behavior of a particular species. In other words, technological urbanized humanity is susceptible to the butterfly effect. The biosphere is actually going to survive. As long as we don't blow up the whole planet, the biosphere is going to be fine. We may not make it. And that's what we need to really focus on, is we need to learn from the parts of the biosphere. There are many, many species that are doing really well coping with climate change, but we don't talk about them. We talk about, oh, look at this, my favorite animal is going extinct, my favorite plant's going extinct, but the biosphere is doing fine. It's extremely robust, but we're in trouble. Okay, and so this is another one of my favorites. The planet's biosphere is collapsing as our industrial growth overwhelms ecosystems, abruptly changes the climate, but we're pleased to be the smartest creatures ever to inhabit Earth, and our technology should save us as long as it proves economically feasible. All right, so the newest phrase that I've seen showing up in some of the science journalist writings is what's being called the Great Upheaval. And many of you know that a lot of climate change models are now converging on 2050 as a likely tipping point for a number of different phenomena, from sea level rises to atmospheric warming, and internal migration, droughts and floods that affect food security. All of these things seem to be sort of converging on 2050 as the major point at which humanity will have done itself in. Now, between 2023 and 2050, doesn't leave us a lot of time to change the trajectory, to change our behavior. The good news is that we actually could do it, because we're not in this position because our evolutionary history made us suicidal as a species. So we could, if we wanted to, we could actually, it's like, doctor, it hurts when I do this. Okay, stop doing this. All right. So we have, at this point in time, we have a global external threat to all groups of human beings. And at the same time, we have internal socio-political instability in virtually every country on the planet. Climate change is a national security issue for every country on the planet. Socio-political instability, fragmentation within each country is a national security issue for every country. We have an inside and an outside problem happening at the same time. This is not good. I mean, this is a reason for us to really think seriously about changing our behavior. Okay. So what we're saying is that the Anthropocene was never sustainable. Starting 15,000 years ago, we, as a species, opted for a set of behaviors and a course of action that was going to get us to where we are now. And in a sense, that doesn't really help, because, okay, yes, if we knew then what we knew now, blah, 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 blah. More than likely, if we knew then what we knew now, somebody would have said, yes, but we're different. And it'll be different this time. Okay, so that's not the real point of this. The real point of this is to recognize that the change in humanity 1,000 generations ago was the result of conscious behavioral changes that we made. We thought, everybody who made those decisions thought they were good ideas at the time. People were just trying to save their families, protect their towns, whatever. But it turns out to have been the wrong thing. And the good news is that because it was not some sort of evolutionary imperative, we have the capacity to change what we're doing fairly quickly if we want to. But by now we have 9,000 years of being addicted to a particular way of doing things. So we have these embedded narratives, we have these embedded pathways. We even have scientists who attempt to justify our behavior retroactively by changing evolutionary theory to make it appear that these kinds of conflict without resolution dynamics have always been part of evolutionary theory, even though it's not true. So we're now in what we call the autumn of the Anthropocene. We can survive this going forward, but we have to change what we're doing. And in order for that to happen, what we need is a set of guidelines based on the recognition that we changed our behavior 9,000 years ago, and that was a mistake. So what we're suggesting is that if we want to change our behavior, and we want to change that behavior along the lines of survival, then what we want are guidelines based on Darwinian principles. Okay, so what we need is something analogous to the International Declaration of Human Rights. This would be something along the lines of a declaration of rights and responsibilities. Okay. The conversation is about survival. We should use Darwinian principles. And the policy foundation is what we call the 4 laws of biotics. And we've stolen that from Isaac Asimov's 4 laws of robotics. And we acknowledge that. So, okay. And the Zeroth Law is that humanity, so these are guidelines for how we should be behaving. First is that humanity cannot destroy the biosphere. And they can't allow the biosphere to be destroyed. Okay, that's the Zeroth Law, because that's the overarching, it's like the Zeroth Law of thermodynamics. Okay, the first law is that humanity may not harm any part of the biosphere if that will harm the biosphere as a whole. And then following from that, humanity can use the biosphere or parts of the biosphere so long as that use doesn't jeopardize the survival of the biosphere. And humanity can even protect its own existence as it sees necessary, quote unquote, from the biosphere, from parts of the biosphere, so long as those protective measures do not put the biosphere in jeopardy. Okay, that's pretty, general motherhood statements. It is don't do stupid shit, as Barack Obama once told his advisors. Okay, now, so what does this mean with respect to conservation biology and biodiversity science? Turns out to be a very simple fix. Unfortunately, there's only one example of this policy being followed in all of conservation biology on this entire planet. In other words, we have to, if we want to conserve biodiversity, we need to establish places where there is a large enough space and enough diversity of habitats so that as the climate changes, species can move around. They can move away from conditions that are no longer good into conditions where they can continue to survive. In other words, we need to provide conservation areas that are what we call evolutionary commons. So places where the evolutionary process can take place, because that's the only way that extinction is mitigated and diversification can re-evolve following any kind of extinction. Okay. And this is, again, as I said, that's based on the assumption that the biosphere is not susceptible to the butterfly effect. In fact, the biosphere is heavily buffered against the butterfly effect, so long as it's in an evolutionary commons. It's in a large enough and diverse enough set of environments that evolutionary mechanisms can work. Okay, and the only evolutionary commons on the entire planet is the Área de Conservación Guanacaste in northwest Costa Rica. This is the conservation area that was the brainchild of Dan Jansen, who was the first winner of the Crawford Prize and who used his prize money from the Crawford Prize to secure funding to get this started. But this is the only one on the entire planet. And at the moment, if we think that preserving the biosphere means preserving the evolutionary process, any money that's being spent on conservation biology that isn't doing this is throwing money in the trash. There's a reason why conservation biology has become a chorus of the recently departed. Oh, these have gone extinct. Oh, these have gone extinct. Oh, these have gone extinct. Give us more money and we'll save them. Oh, they went extinct anyway. Give us more money and we'll save these other guys. Okay. The World Wildlife Fund and polar bears is a perfect example. The World Wildlife Fund says, you send us a lot of money, we'll save the polar bears. So what are they going to do? Get enormous long extension cords from Vancouver and Toronto and move refrigerators up to the Arctic and open them up and refreeze the Arctic? No. The reason polar bears are in trouble is not because the ice is melting, it's because polar bears have the potential to survive without polar ice, because polar bears evolved before the current polar ice shield existed. What happens when the polar ice goes away? The sea lions and the seals that the bears eat will move off the ice packs back onto shore where they came from, and the bears will follow them, and they'll be fine. The problem with polar bears is that in the places where polar bears would go if the ice disappears, there are now humans, and we don't want the polar bears to come there. So it's got nothing to do with biology. The polar bears are quite capable of surviving if all the ice in the Arctic goes away. And in fact, there is a place in the United States, in Alaska, that's been set aside as a reserve, and the polar bears are moving back to it. And they're living along the shore, and they're doing fine. The ones that have found it. Okay, now, interacting with each other. What do these principles suggest? What do the 4 laws of biotics suggest with respect to how humans behave with each other? Well, first of all, we need to switch from the economics of growth to the economics of well-being. Grow as much as possible, so long as your growth doesn't hurt other people, doesn't hurt the biosphere, doesn't do permanent damage to anything. We need reduced population density, not reduced numbers of human beings. We don't have to worry about that because the most recent report by Lancet on global fertility rates shows that global fertility rates are beginning to drop and beginning to drop drastically. The most current estimate is that instead of the human population asymptoting at 11 billion people in 2100, we now expect it to asymptote at 9.5 billion people in 2070. That's an enormous change. We're now at 2070 for human population starting to bring itself down. That's only 20 years past our concern point of 2050, where we may be hitting all these tipping points. Well, if we're within that range, we're now possibly within the range in which our own behavioral changes could actually make a difference. We could actually go a long way to preserving a lot of the technological infrastructure that we have at the moment. And we have to understand that what we call better can be bigger. In other words, when you reduce population density, when you go to the economics of well-being, it doesn't mean this is not anti-growth. I mean, for one thing, growth is a built-in feature of all biological systems. I mean, we get growth for free. The problem is that unlimited growth is a problem. Okay, so we can have survivable regrowth. In other words, we can have redistributing people doesn't mean killing half of the people on the planet to solve the problem. Now, the way that this happens is that the economics of well-being, basically, Darwin taught us that maximum growth, unconstrained growth, is pathological. And that was one of the messages of Darwin's book that most Victorians hated. It's one of the reasons that the racist sociologist Herbert Spencer was able to modify Darwin's message in the popular literature into survival of the fittest. Because that's what people wanted to hear. They didn't want to hear that message of Darwin, that unconstrained growth is pathological, because that immediately implies that we have a responsibility. Okay? It means that we should be practicing net savings during good times, accumulating all that potential, and we should be spending during bad times. Everybody tells you that that's how you should run your family finances, right? When you've got a lot of money, save it, because save it for a rainy day, right? But there's no country on the planet that does this. Every country on the planet does exactly the opposite. We got money, let's spend it so we can get reelected. Oh, times are bad, we can't spend anything. So we do exactly the wrong thing because we're overshooting, because a system based on the notion that growth is good is going to create those sorts of problems. The informal economy is what represents the potential for economic transitions. Okay, cities in the United States that have a substantial number of quote unquote ethnic restaurants, so international restaurants. Many of those restaurants started out as street side carts by immigrants who were selling their food on the street and not reporting the income. So officially, every government hates the informal economy because it doesn't generate tax revenue. But the reality is, you don't need it to generate tax revenue until it becomes a success. During a transitional time, you want the informal economy to be very, very active. Now, what's another example of the informal economy? Oh, Silicon Valley startups. See, when we talk about street food, it's, oh, you know, those are bad immigrants, blah, blah. Silicon Valley startups, oh, this is really good for the economy. They're both examples of the informal economy. This is lubrication for economic transitions. What we have to understand is that when we're transitioning from one state to another, one steady state to another steady state in response to something like climate change, we have to understand that a reduction in productivity is going to be an indication that the system is adapting properly. It is not an indication that something is wrong. And in fact, if there's a reduction in productivity, this is a big mistake that a number of biodiversity specialists make in believing that, oh, productivity in this forest is dropping. We have to go in and we have to artificially boost up the productivity, and then everything collapses and they don't know why. It's because the biosphere is already beginning to cope with climate change by adapting. And if we stop it, if we don't recognize that in some cases, lowered productivity is an indication that the system is actually moving in the right direction, and we intervene to stop that, with all our good intentions, we're going to be making it worse. Okay. Now, it also means that we should be circularizing our local economies. Okay. More use and reuse, less linear, material in, waste out, less single-use products and things like that. Okay. So Kurt Vonnegut said, we'll go down in history as the first society that wouldn't save itself because it wasn't cost effective. Now, here's this. This was obviously a cute, quippy quote by a famous author. But let me ask you this: if someone like this, who is not a professional scientist or a professional policy person, knows this, why are we doing what we're doing? If it's so obvious to somebody that this is really the wrong way of going about things, why do we keep saying, no, we're going to make it right? You can't make it right because it's wrong fundamentally. Okay, cities. Cities are a problem. And I know I'm stepping on a lot of toes now because there is an enormous movement, mostly by architects and some physicists, saying that the way to preserve the biosphere is to jam human beings into into fewer and fewer, larger and larger cities. Cities are the problem. Cities are not a solution. Making them bigger makes the problem worse. What we need to do is to decentralize. Big cities are very difficult to circularize, for example. Small cities are fairly easy to circularize. One of the things we learned during the pandemic is that we have the technology to allow people to work remotely. we have the ability to take 1 million people, put them into 300 small cities, connect them up with transit and internet, and preserve all of the benefits of a city of 1 million people in a small number of circular economies where population density is survivable and the local economy is survivable. Okay, and once again, I mean, there's no such thing as an apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic novel where everybody runs to the big city for safety. When there was a massive COVID outbreak in India, what did people in Mumbai, what did people do? They ran home to their cities in the rural areas, their towns in the rural areas where they had come from. Now, it turned out that many of them were already infected by the time they went there, so they spread the virus out in the cities. But the point is that the human impulse is to run away from these artificial constructs. And that's actually the right impulse. And we should facilitate that because it's going to help us survive. 1953, American mystery writer Raymond Chandler wrote this statement in his novel, The Long Goodbye. And this is so evocative. And this is in 1953. This captures the essence of modern cities. There's all this wonderful stuff, and they are centers of misery because it's a really unnatural existence. Cities are a problem for climate change. Cities are big heat producers. Cities are a huge problem for pandemics. These are all of the aspects of big cities that increase disease risk. Okay, and that includes novel environments for zoonoses. One of the best ways to maintain emerging infectious diseases in cities is to build urban green spaces. So there are no simple solutions to this, right? I mean, yes, but the urban green spaces are this, that, and the other. Well, yeah, it's true. But the reality is the more urban green spaces you have, the more places you have where zoonotic diseases are going to hang out. On Margaret Island in Hungary, this is the island in the Danube between Buda and Pest. There's a large touristy area, big music festivals every year. The hedgehogs on Margaret Island are loaded with viruses and bacteria that are capable of infecting humans. And the hedgehogs on Margaret Island have 10 times the number of ticks that are vectors for these diseases as hedgehogs out in the forests. Cities, there's a sense in which I want to say we can no longer afford big cities if we want to survive. And one of the big things, of course, is that the standard of living for most people in big cities is artificial. So the idea, you go to the big city and you make a lot of money. It's an artificial lifestyle that's supported by a whole bunch of poor people. And in particular, these are people who are invisible to public services, and they're people who are so poor that they cannot afford to stay home from work if they're sick. And these are the people that do our laundry, clean our dishes, serve our food, take care of our old parents and grandparents in assisted living homes. We've done this to ourselves. Okay, well, this is a shameless plug for our book about climate change and emerging diseases. Now, how do we divest the big cities, especially the big cities in climate insecure areas? So you have to understand that more than 50% of human beings now live in cities. In the United States, more than 50% of Americans live within 100 kilometers of the ocean. Unless every climate scientist dealing with sea level rises and glacial melt is wrong, all of those cities right now should be emptying out. Because we don't know. 80,000 years ago, the Greenland ice shield slipped into the ocean one night. I mean, it just slipped in the ocean all at once. Raised sea levels 7 meters. Okay, that would give all of the coastal cities in Europe and North America about 3 hours to evacuate. Not going to happen, right? And let's suppose that we have a disaster and we see the sea level rise is coming, and it doesn't immediately just kill everybody in New York and Boston and Philadelphia. So there's some idea that there's some time for people to escape. Now, my country, in the United States, I live in North Carolina. I live in the western part of North Carolina, 400 kilometers from the ocean, 800 meters elevation. I'm good, unless all of the people in the lowlands come storming into my town. And because they're Americans, they all have guns. So chaotic retreat is not an option. And that's disaster. We need to manage this retreat. Okay, we'll just, sorry about that. And I already mentioned this, that better can be bigger. So what we need to do is to decentralize and resist the urge to reconsolidate. Just build more nodes of connected small circular economies instead of rebuilding big cities. Okay. So we've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. We know what we've been doing. Climate change is not going to help us survive because disasters do not create innovation. The arms race was never a good idea. Walter Scott knew that war is the only game that humans play where everybody loses. We've known this for a long time. John Steinbeck says, war is our greatest indication of humans' failure as a thinking animal. We're heading for a fall. The only question is whether we're going to fall to our knees and be able to get up, or whether we're going to fall on our face and have to rebuild. And I'll stop it at that point.
All right.
My apologies.
Thank you so much. Oh, that was great. So any questions in the audience? All right. Over there.
Thank you, Daniel. It's really a very impressive talk. Yeah, I was wondering, you said that it was a conscious human decision to decide to fight, to fly. And I'm really wondering whether it are in fact conscious decisions. The fact that you're aware of what you're going to do and your planet.
Yeah.
We have the perception that we make conscious decisions, but
Right.
I really wonder whether it's the case and whether we are that different from other animals. So
well, we are the same as other animals in the sense that our instinct is to run away from conflict.
yeah, we perceive it as a
But deciding to stay and actually amplify the conflict, that's something very different. That's something very human. But it's not an inherited trait. We know that being warlike is not an inherited trait because we know how much psychological and emotional and physical abuse it takes to turn young children into soldiers. And we have to really expend a lot of energy on impressionable young people to convince them to go out and kill other people. So it's not part of our nature. I mean, we can be manipulated. That's part of our nature. But our instinct is to run away from conflict. Our instinct is to not fight. Now, all species are capable of some level of aggression when they feel threatened. Okay, but war is not the same thing as you know, somebody came into my house and they were trying to kill my children, so I killed them. That's a different sort of thing. And maybe I didn't make that entirely clear.
Thank you.
I would also like to ask a question about decisions, because you said 9,000 years ago, we started with, you know, the war machines, and you said we made a decision. So first of all, who is the we? But the question really is, we still make war. We still have everything you said about what happened after 9,000. We still have one change, but we are sort of building like an archaeological layer, you know, on what we decided then, and then you have another layer and so on. And so I wonder, does this somehow fit into something you did not mention, namely cultural evolution? Because we have biological evolution, but we also know we have cultural evolution, for better and for worse. And how do the two fit together in your view?
Well, cultural evolution is an element of Darwinian evolution for species that have cultures. Okay,
But what
we're a
difference
species
does
with
it make?
culture, therefore our culture is part of the evolutionary story. There's no question about that. But I can maybe answer that part by answering your first question. I mean, obviously, I'm being a bit metaphorical and a bit rhetorical in saying, you know, we decided to do this to ourselves. The reality is that as far as we can tell, the we in this is the small number of people in these early urbanized settings who used social institutions as a way to amplify personal power and convince larger numbers of people in the city to go and do something. Okay, so it's not I'm not saying that, oh, there were 500,000 people in the city and 500,000 people decided to go invade this other. It doesn't take that. It only takes a small number of people in positions of influence and responsibility, where other people will pay attention to them. And if you have a governance system that is headed up by a small number of people who want to go and take something from somebody else, and they can convince the head of the local religion to support them, then suddenly you have different social institutions in the same place all saying the same thing. And the next thing you know, somebody is telling you that it's a moral imperative, it's morally justified. In fact, it's morally necessary for you to go and kill those other people. And besides, somebody has decided that those other people in the other city are not really human beings, so it's okay for you to kill them anyway. And it says, I mean, the terrible truth about this is that it's not that complicated to see how this could be going. And not that complicated to see how there would always be people who would take advantage of those social institutions. Partly because the social institutions do provide a positive function most of the time. When conditions are good, nobody goes to war. War is not something that people initiate out of a feeling of strength. War is something that's initiated when people are afraid and when they feel weak. So war is something that is a response to weakness, not to strength. And when human beings are afraid, then we can talk about human beings as social primates. When social primates are afraid, they will do whatever the alpha male or the alpha female decides to do, which is usually to run away from the danger, and they follow. So it's not all, it's the terrible thing is that it's not all that complicated to see how this could happen. Yeah, Andrew.
Dan, this is fantastic. One of the puzzles that we have today is that, complexity is all about becoming more and more diverse.
Right.
Yet the human narrative that it preaches that democracy and freedom, right? But actually the reality in human society is to concentrate.
Yeah.
How do you explain this?
Well, I think the impulse inherited impulse in human beings is to form social groups made up of people that are closely related to you. I don't think it's a human impulse to make big cities. I think that's something we've become accustomed to. And there, of course, there are benefits of living in a big city and this sort of thing, but there's short-term benefits. The underlying impulse, I mean, for 149,000 out of those 150,000 generations of human beings, human social groups were between 20 and 50, maybe 100 people, and they were extended family groups. Everybody knew each other. If everybody knew who could be trusted, the people who couldn't live with the group were pushed out, that's survivable and manageable. So one of the questions we know, I think we have good reason to know that enormously, highly densely populated cities are not working. Now, how small do they have to be? Or let's say, what's the largest manageable size that you can have? You need a city that's small enough so that a majority of the citizens can recognize if a sociopath attempts to take over social control and manipulate the whole town. And if you have too many people, if you have so many people in the city so that that kind of personality can hide and take advantage of social institutions, then you run into problems. And so I don't know what that number is, but I think that's part of the rural revitalization experiment in places like some of the parts of the United States. I think that's one of the things that we may find out if we have enough time. We may find out what is the upper bound on number of human beings that can coexist survivably.
Yes, thank you very much. From the you stressed the point that it is not bad conditions that generate innovations,
That's
but
right.
it's stable conditions or especially good conditions or whatever. Maybe you could elaborate on that so that we can get an idea on what kind of group size or person diversity or evolutionary diversity is needed, what's the kind of stable condition that is needed. So maybe it's possible to shade some parts away from the big chaos that's going on, just to generate the impression of stability that's needed to generate innovation that's wishful or something.
Okay, there are actually two different questions in there. So let me give you an illustration that we would use with our first year biology students sometimes. So this is the edge of a cliff, okay, and 100 meters below are rocks. So I line up 100 undergraduates and I start pushing them off one after another. At what point will wings evolve? How many have to die before wings will evolve? What's the answer?
Never.
Never. That's right. So that's a very practical example of how you don't innovate under stress. What will happen under that kind of stress is that you expect one of the undergraduates to say, I'm not letting you push me off the cliff, I'm running away. And that's how evolution actually works. The problem is that human beings seem to have three very important needs. One of them is a need for magic. Okay, technology will save us. John Wayne will save us. Okay, we have a great need for magic. We have a great need for heroic acts. Okay, that's one of the reasons that we let pandemics get out of control. We let disease outbreaks become pandemics because no public health official can stand up and say, you know, those 5 pandemics that did not happen last year, that's on us. No politician can get elected by saying, you know, those 200 terrorist attacks that did not happen last year, we did that. And that's a very human thing. I mean, we respond to that. And we also really, really dislike hearing bad news, especially if the bad news involves taking personal responsibility. Okay, if a leopard eats a member of the primate group, the leader of the group is going to be blamed. Nobody's going to say, yeah, you know, that person was just that monkey was unlucky. He didn't run away when the rest of us ran away, or he was too slow to get away from the leopard. It's going to be, it's his fault. So we like to find fault. We don't like to take personal responsibility. We like heroic stories. We like magical explanations. Okay. And you're asking me for a magical explanation. You're asking me for what we would call a silver bullet in public health. What are the conditions that we can impose in one place and keep those conditions static, which would stimulate evolution? But that's the wrong question. Static conditions don't stimulate evolution. Static conditions stimulate messing around and coming up with stuff. Now, even if you are a species that's in stable conditions for a very long time and you become highly variable, and then conditions change, there's still no guarantee that all that new variability that you've accumulated will include what you need to be able to survive. You may still go extinct. So the reality is that in order to increase the chances of the biosphere evolving, coping with climate change by evolving, you have to stop trying to control the conditions. You have to allow organisms to do what they do, even though that means in some cases, some of the species are going extinct.
We need to wrap up.
Okay.
Business coffee time. I have one final thing before we let people go for coffee.
Okay.
So you have in your next coming book, you have this one word in there called hope.
Right.
In a long time. Can you give us a glimpse into what are the evolutionary mechanisms that offers us a little bit of hope?
Oh, well, yeah, there are two things we can do. We can change our behavior now at great expense and great discomfort and avoid the 2050 meltdown, or at least minimize the effects. Or because evolution not only explains why things persist, it also explains why things recover. We can wait, we can do what we're doing now, we can collapse in 2050, and we can use these same principles to rebuild and hopefully not make the same mistakes going forward. Now, that's why I said it's a faint hope.
Right.
But it's still,
I mean, these are those options for Sal and I believe that those options are better than unattainable utopia or unacceptable apocalypse.
You see it in Rwanda, where it has happened. They had a terrible crisis over there. But it's one of the few countries that I know where they really countered corruption in a big way and developed. And they can sell it, or the leadership can sell it on the basis of a horrible event that happened over there. So that is maybe an explanation, an example.
Well, human beings are capable of surviving.
Oh, yes.
And we've been around for 3 million years. We've been through a lot of environmental insults, but mostly we survived by avoiding conflict whenever possible.
brilliant. And to survive the next part of the day, we need some coffee.